In the first session and in sessions this afternoon, we'll talk a lot about many of the challenges, the issues, economic, social policies, some of the big challenges that we face for our economy, for our society, in Canada, in a global context. And the question we want to address in this panel is, what does a modern public service look like to be able to grapple effectively, to anticipate, to have the right kind of data, the right kind of people, to really grapple and make good public policy, to manage well, and to steer us through some of those big challenges. At a time when we're again looking at major public service reform at the federal level with Blueprint 2020, as other levels of government are struggling with similar kinds of issues as to structure, to what does it take for modern public service. So my pleasure to introduce Chancellor's Professor Leslie Powell, who has written more books than most of us read in a year, probably only exceeded by one of our panelists, Bruce Doern. So Professor Powell, over to you.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thanks to the audience for attending this event. We have a pressing question for this panel that builds very much on the excellent panel that we had earlier this morning, and that's about the nature of a modern public service or a modern public sector, or even more broadly, the nature of modern governance and effective and efficient governance. It's a burning question. And it's one that countries around the world have to address, and they do it in a variety of different ways, through dealing with corruption, through dealing with human resource management issues, through budgetary and financial questions. So a lot of the policy issues that came up this morning are really underpinned by more fundamental questions about the nature of governance and public sectors and public service, and how well they perform in delivering those economic and social policies. Now, before I introduce the panel and before I make some broader remarks as part of that introduction, we're going to give you a chance to reflect a little bit on your own thoughts on public sector reform. As Susan mentioned, we have an instant poll for you. And the poll is asking you, and you can whip out your smartphones now. The poll is asking you that if you had a magic wand and could reform and improve and modernize the Canadian federal public service, but had only one priority, you couldn't do it all at once, which would that broad priority be? Would it be in the area of financials, better links between spending and performance, human resource management, recruitment, retention, and training, IT, wider and deeper use of information technologies, strategic capacity, improving foresight and policy advice, and horizontal capacity, improving partnerships, collaboration, and co-delivery. Those are not, of course, in the real world mutually exclusive, but we're going to ask you to try to select a priority amongst those five if you were the czar of the federal public service and could wave your wand. I don't know if czars wave wands, but if they could, then which one of these would you select? So we'll give you a few moments as I make some introductory remarks, and then you can punch in your preference, and we'll reveal all just before lunch and let you know what the collective wisdom of the audience is. So I've already mentioned the importance of the issue. I think for this audience I don't have to belabor it, and I won't. The key point to, I guess, keep in mind is that the public service itself and the public sector itself has become a policy issue. We have economic policies, we have social policies, we have foreign policies, but it really wasn't until the 1970s or so that the area of public sector, public sector reform itself became a policy priority. Obviously, governments have reformed themselves and modernized by tinkering in different areas at different times, more or less incrementally. But the question or the idea of actually looking at an entire public sector, of looking at governance as a whole and assessing that governance system is something that only struck people as a viable policy field in the 1970s, and of course it's accelerated dramatically. I won't belabor the point, but there are a multitude of indicators and indices out there, ones which I think everybody would be familiar in this audience, for example, the Transparency International, which is a league table of countries ranked according to their transparency in dealing with corruption issues. And those are, when you think about it, they're standing back and they're assessing Canada and comparing it to Denmark or the United Arab Emirates or Ukraine in terms of dealing with corruption. That's an assessment of an entire governance system. The World Bank governance indicators, worldwide governance indicators, is another very popular measure that actually tries to assess along 6 different dimensions: voice and accountability, corruption, government efficiency, tries to assess and provide an index of the quality of governance in countries. That's a big deal. It's not an easy thing. Many of us have trouble even assessing whether our municipal governments are effective or efficient, but what about standing back and assessing an entire country or an entire province or even regions, the European Union, for example. So this issue has accelerated and become important as a policy field in its own right, and we're very fortunate to have 4 distinguished panelists, 3 here in body, 1 in spirit or digitally, to help us walk through some of these issues. You have the bios, so I'm not going to go into detail. But on my immediate left, Catherine MacQuarrie, who's a Vice President at the Canada School and a Vice President for Strategic Issues. So she's very much occupied with thinking about where the federal government system will be going in the next, well, I won't say 60 years, but maybe a somewhat shorter horizon. And to her left is Mr. George Ross, who's the Deputy Minister of Northern Development and Mines, but he also has the distinction of being the outgoing president of IPAC, the Institute for Public Administration of Canada. So he is both a practitioner and I guess I won't say a theorist, but a reflector of public service issues and modernizing government from those 2 perspectives. And to his immediate left is Bruce Doern, a most prolific, as Susan was saying. I think Bruce has written about every single conceivable public policy and about every conceivable ministry or department or agency. So he's covered the field, and we're very lucky to have him here. And we also have Mr. Nick Manning, who will appear momentarily on screen. Mr. Manning is in Washington. He couldn't make it here, but he is with us, as I say, in digital spirit. And he's the just recently formerly the head of the governance and public management division within the World Bank. The bank is not, as one might think, it's simply a bank, but a big part of its business in recent years has been to look at public sector reform for obvious reasons. It doesn't matter how efficient your tax system is if your officials are corrupt. So public sector reform, public sector management has become a major issue for the World Bank, and Nick has been contributing to that debate and discussion in the World Bank and other international organizations as well. So we will now, the voting period is over, so if you haven't yet, then take another second and punch in your priority, and we'll move directly to Ms. MacQuarrie.
Thanks very much, Les. Can I get some personal business out of the way first?
Absolutely.
Hi, Mom. Our elder this morning is my mother, I'm proud to say it. We only found out last night that when we were chatting on the phone, she said, I got to go in the morning and open some sort of thing at Carleton. So I'm glad she could stay. So we were asked to do probably no more than 8 minutes if possible as sort of introductory remarks before we get into the conversation. So I wanted to try and sort of romp through sort of 3 basic themes. First, talk to you a little bit about this Blueprint 2020 process in government. Second, talk about kind of what's different and fundamentally what's not different in terms of public sector reform. And then we were also asked to consider, is there a new emerging model of public sector? And I'm going to try and argue that there's not. So for those of you who are not familiar with Blueprint 2020, this is an initiative our clerk of the Privy Council launched last June, which is really a conversation with public servants to talk about how the public service needs to be adapting to all the global and societal forces that are challenging so many institutions around the world, not just public sector. Dealing with issue complexity, demographic shifts both within and without, and really looking for new and improved approaches to our jobs and to serving Canadians. It's critical to the society's well-being, it's critical to competitiveness as an employer and as an organization, and indeed maybe even our relevance. So it's a result of, it didn't just form fully fledged, it's the result of about 8 months of study by a group of deputy ministers that I had the pleasure of supporting when I was at Privy Council office. And they came together to have a series, we did research and have a series of discussion around that research on what the federal public service needed to be, how it needed to be changing in the decades ahead. And so the resulting work was Blueprint 2020. And it was the clerk who said, you know, I think what we really need to do is have a conversation with public servants around some of these very big themes. Because really, I think part of the issue is thinking about not just where we need to be, but actually how the heck we're going to get there. And I know a lot of the reaction was, oh boy, another renewal initiative in the federal government. Talking to an Ontario colleague this morning who said, you know, haven't we been modernizing for the last 20 years? Why aren't we there yet? And it's a valid point, but I think you need to remember that, you know, the governments are in a constant, and public services with them, are in a constant state of adaptation to their environment. They have been since the beginning of their construction, whether it was a nation-building agenda or dealing with world wars or economic crises or other kinds of catastrophes. We're always having to shift and shape to whatever the demands are of us. So yes, it's we have another renewal initiative, and there'll probably be another one in another 5 years. So if I could just have a slide go up. So academics succeeded without slides this morning, but no public servant ever will.
That's right.
So if you can click, I thought there we go. So I thought it would be fun actually to talk a little bit about what's different, what's not. So on the left, you've got the Blueprint 2020 themes that we're having the conversations about, and no School of Public Policy Administration conference would be complete without some discussion of Weber, which interestingly enough, when I went back and looked at when he did his bureaucratic model, or started to really do it, was around the same time as we're talking about Blueprint 2020, only 100 years ago. You know, when I was thinking about this, there is clearly a lot that's changed. An open and network environment, engaging citizens, partners between hierarchical structures in office and clearly defined divisions of labor. But in fact, there is a lot that is very still similar, and necessarily so in our institutions. And so I just want to talk a little bit about in coming up with Blueprint 2020 and in the conversations we're having and in the choices we need to make in the years ahead, that there are some very necessary tensions and trade-offs between the traditional role and purpose of a public service and the pressures that it's under to modernize, be more nimble, agile, and efficient. And fundamentally, and I think this was already stated this morning, the public service does not exist separately from the democratic framework in government. Regardless of your role, of the political philosophy about, you know, the role of the state, the size, the appropriate scope of government, the institution of the public service has its own purpose, but it does not exist independently of the political institutions that people elect to make the decisions. And so that is a fundamental notion that I believe cannot be forgotten when we talk about reform, in spite of all the pressures to be more nimble, agile, more entrepreneurial. There are really some, you know, sort of essential roles for government that continue throughout: collecting, respending public dollars, redistributing wealth, as we were talking this morning, the collective well-being of society, people's physical safety, regulation, upholding laws. And the accountability for how well done or not these things are, you can't outsource. It will always come back to the elected government to be responsible for accounting for how well it was done. So when we talk about notions like network government, for example, you know, there is a real rub between the fact that in our system of responsible government, ministerial responsibility, that necessitates a certain vertical hierarchy of decision making. Which isn't to say that networked governance, which I think shows a lot of promise for collaboration and efficiency, shouldn't exist. The question is, how can you reconcile it between those two tensions, between the necessity for hierarchical decision making and the benefits of reaching out and working across boundaries. In terms of open government, and I'm using open in the very, very broadest sense, everything from opening up policy advice to a much broader range of interests. Some governments are even experimenting with outsourcing, contracting it out completely. But open data, transparent decision making, the creation, the use and distribution of data, that's a very broad set of issues. And I think there's really no going back from both the opportunities and the perils that are part of the global information age. And certainly, like all institutions, government subject to a much greater level of scrutiny, access, and commentary on practically every twitch and maneuver than at any other time. So again, in terms of open government, it's not a question of whether we should be open or not. But again, it's the thousands of sort of political, ethical, and operational considerations that go along with the choices that the policy and the program and the operational choices that you need to make. Embracing new ways of working, the innovation word, the transformation word gets used a lot, again, in government. And undoubtedly, I think I'm a very big proponent of trying to find new, better ways to do things. The notion that we're spending public money, and as somebody, I think it was Andrew Coyne said this morning, that every dollar you spend in process is one that is lost to making a difference in someone's life, I think is a very, very strong principle to be working from. But we can't just be entrepreneurial. Citizens expect many other things of their government that run counter to desires for agility and responsiveness. Stewardship is a very fundamental part of our job. I go back to our responsibility in safety and security, in economic and political and social stability, and so on. So again, it's that that tension and the balance of choices that you need to make. The last one I'll talk about is the changed employment model. And this has probably been the liveliest conversations within the federal public service on the consultation process. Lots and lots of call for us to kind of break down the way that we have traditionally hired and developed and promoted people. Lots more mobility, moving not just within the federal public service, but in and out. And personally, as a longtime manager, I have a fair amount of sympathy with that. I can't hire a bright new grad very easily, and even if I can, no matter how good they are, I can't give them necessarily the kind of work that my director is doing, even if I think that they're might be a little bit better than the director I have in place. Unfortunately, we have a very rigid and Weberian structure of organizational design and job classification that goes back a very long way. But again, we can't just blow up those systems without thinking about why were they put in place in the first place. And again, going back to a merit-based, nonpartisan public service, with the Public Service Commission playing currently and traditionally a role in protecting that, protecting the ability of public servants to play their role of frank and fearless advice to government to do their jobs without fear of being fired is an absolute fundamental principle of our institution. So as much as it's tempting to play in the realm of human resources, I think it's something that needs to be done with, again, a lot of thoughtfulness. So I'll just end on the point that as much as public service is changing, it needs to change, and it needs to adapt to the expectations, both of government and citizens. I don't see that there's a new model emerging in the way that Weber was able to design 100 years ago, or that labels like New Public Manage were more popular 10 or 20 years ago. I think what we have instead is a growing diversity of tools that we need to thoughtfully apply within public administration, that we use in the context in which both protect and with an understanding of what the core role of a public service is, but that get us to that sense of innovation, of creativity, of results, and certainly the efficiency. How can we do it faster and more easily? And that, I would argue, just to go back to the HR dimension, requires public servants to be probably even more professional than any other time, more fully trained with a more nuanced understanding of their role in the support of government and democracy, and to have the judgment to be able to make some of those choices for reform more wisely. Thanks.
Great, thank you. George?
Can I have the clicker? I think I'm going to do it from my chair.
All right, okay.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here today. I need to just tell everybody my perspective on today's session. I am a 30-year public servant in the provincial system in Ontario, so I am a classic old grinder. Worked my way through the trenches in a number of different ministries. So I have a perspective on the future of public service from practitioners, through a practitioner's lens, but also have spent a lot of time working in IPAC, and most recently as a national president of IPAC. And through IPAC, we do a lot of survey work, and we listen to a lot of public servants across the country, and in fact, around the world. And what I want to do today is reflect a little bit on leadership challenges for the public service. Catherine mentioned some of those and the boundary conditions around public servants in our professional world. But there is a new paradigm emerging, and it is one that there are no clear models that are emerging for delivery of public services, but it is going to put a lot of stress and challenges on the backs of leaders in public service. So I am a public servant, so I have to grind my way through some slides as well. My apologies. I know there were some disparaging remarks earlier on about PowerPoint. So maybe I can get those up now, please. So in 2011, IPAC did a major survey of public servants across the country with Deloitte. And the number one issue that came up on the minds of public servants across the country when it comes to professional development was leadership skills and capacity in leadership. So public servants across this country are sensing a change in the role, are understanding challenges ahead of them, and they're calling out for new tools and new training when it comes to leadership. So on the minds of public servants across the country, leadership, tools, training, and equipping them, the public servant leaders, for the future challenges is number one priority. I think it's really important when we're talking about this that we don't look at this through the lens of the current challenges or the past challenges that we've been faced with. Over the last several years, there's been a lot of pressure on public sector leaders to deliver programs that were really focused on economic recovery. So major infrastructure programs, austerity planning, budget control, all those sorts of things have been major challenges for public servants right across the country and in fact globally. In the longer term though, the challenges are much more significant and more daunting for public servants. There are major global societal shifts that are going on, demographic challenges, and new calls from citizens on delivery models and engagement with government that the current models of government aren't prepared to deal with. So, leaders across the country, public sector leaders, new public servants are all thinking about these sorts of things and trying to figure out how to grapple with these big big problems. So, you know, we went through, I mean, I'm reflecting a little bit on my public service career here, but through the 90s and into the 2000s, there was a lot of very complicated problems that were tackled. New shared services models for backroom delivery in government, new services to public where we were merging across departmental lines. Those are very complicated problems. A lot of them were IT-enabled solutions that were put in place. And they required strong leadership within departments to really set in place processes and put resources in place and project manage through those challenges. This new paradigm that we're talking about with these different societal shifts are really moving us into the realm of wicked problems. So these are things where, you know, governments and public servants can't even agree on the problem definition, and how to tackle those problems is not going to be the trade of an individual department, a leader in a department. It's really going to require a knitting together of functional groups within government, and also a very deep engagement with citizens and stakeholders. And I make the distinction there between stakeholders and citizens because we frequently mistake those two things. So, you know, we are well into the realm of moving into this world of wicked problems. A lot of the major transformation, backroom transformation, efficiency measures that were driven by IT and social media, a lot of those have been tackled. That's not to say there isn't still more efficiency programming that can be put in place, but the new world of problems are very different. When we polled, IPAC does regular polling of deputy ministers and CAOs of large municipalities across the province. One of the things in the last poll that came forward as a significant issue is this whole area of changing relationships between government and society, between public servants and citizens, and between public servants and the elected officials that we serve. Catherine, I think, quite rightly pointed out that, you know, we are not apart and distinct from our political masters. We are part of the democratic institutions that we serve. But there is some concern that's being voiced by senior executives across government around the nature of the relationships that we have as public servants with a variety of these groups. And the one I've highlighted here is with political staff. So the emergence of political staff in ministers' offices has changed the dynamic between public sector leaders and the elected officials. And there is a concern amongst senior public servants across the country that there isn't clarity and appreciation for the roles and the boundary conditions around those. So this is another area of evolution when it comes to public services, really around relationships. And you know, another example, we could use some other examples here as well, but another example is increasing reliance on private sector delivery, public-private partnerships, different partnerships models. In my world that I'm in now, you know, the engagement with First Nations, Aboriginal communities, and sharing in resource development and management of resources. All these are emerging areas. So relationships is another big area. So, you know, what are the competencies of the leaders here? You know, I think I'm going to ask everybody to suspend cynicism here for a little while, because some of these are fairly high level and aspirational. But, you know, I guess I would argue that it's inevitable that in the future, leaders in the public sector are going to have to really have competencies of collaboration. Managing departments, managing these hierarchical organizations that are associated with ministerial accountability are important, will continue to be. But the pathway to solutions here is really a collaboration across boundaries. There is going to need to be a definition of what entrepreneurism is in public service. A lot of countries are grappling with this. A lot of countries are establishing incubators to drive innovation and entrepreneurism in the public sector. There's something there that we're going to have to tackle as a community over the next little while. We're going to have to define the boundary conditions and understand what it means to be innovative and entrepreneurial in the sector, and because it's going to require us to be much more nimble, much more thoughtful, and working in the area of ideas and concepts more so than we have been in the past. I can tell you that this next point around resilience is critical. Public sector leaders need to be very resilient. There is a lot of adaptation going on as the role of government changes, and we need nimble and resilient public servants going forward, especially in leadership capacities. A couple other things here as well, and one that always sends shivers through everybody's spine when you talk about it is public servants that are prepared to take on a higher degree of risk. And that's another area that we really need to define and talk about going forward. So our role in policy, program development, implementation is changing as well. We are into a time of decentralization, devolution, as I said, more reliance on outside organizations to input into policy and to deliver on programs. That puts pressure on us. There's going to be more reliance on government systems. Government will seem to be a facilitator of dialogues, a facilitator of policy development, and the robustness, the efficacy of the systems we put in place, our ability to bring credible data and information to those processes is going to be a key component of what we do in the future. And Catherine mentioned this as well. Notwithstanding all of this heady times ahead and a new role for us, we will still have a very, very critical role in oversight and accountability. Along with decentralization, devolution always comes risk of public issues and mismanagement, and we will not be able to move away from our clear accountability in overseeing delivery models and really stewards for taxpayers' dollars. So a little bit more here on sort of what the leader entrepreneur will look like here. I'm not going to go over this in detail here, but it is really focusing on bringing ideas forward for innovation, and also, I would argue that in the future, people in leadership roles in government are going to have to be responsible for more of the full value chain of public policy. So it's not just analyzing, bringing options forward, being independent and objective, but we are going to have to move into the realm of concepts and ideas, and harnessing ideas from citizens and moving those through the system, and perhaps in some cases even advocating or selling them within government. So a bit of a marketing role. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. And now we will move to Washington, figuratively speaking, to hear from Nick Manning. Hello, Nick.
Hello. Well, good morning, everybody, and apologies for talking to you all via digitally, but this was the only way to arrange this practically. The parameters that I have to talk within, so I got 8 minutes, slide free, via Skype, and talk about the world. So it's possible that what I'm about to say, there's a few heroic generalizations in order to condense it all into that. But I want to talk a little bit about the what we're seeing in terms of developments in the public sector within the OECD countries, the high-income, institutionally robust countries, Canada, UK, France, etc., and how that differs and how it's similar to what we're seeing in developments in public management in low-income countries or the institutionally weaker settings, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, etc. So I'm going to just very quickly skim through some of the similarities, some of the differences, but I want to end up with a couple of risks which surprisingly are shared, I think, between both settings. So let me begin just with the similarities, and I'm going to be very brief here, and these are fairly obvious. So whatever the setting, whatever the country context, then the tasks of the public sector very broadly are similar. The delivery of tangible outputs that matter to citizens and to firms, ensuring services are delivered, health, education, managing infrastructure and other public investments. the regulation of social and economic behaviour. So, I mean, the sort of tangible outputs that the public sector has to deliver. But then also the intangible or less tangible deliverables, particularly managing public revenues, expenditures, debts, ensuring that the public sector lives within the fiscal aggregates, etc., managing across levels of government. So both those tangible and those intangible deliverables are, broadly similar between settings. The second similarity, and again, just for brevity, forgive me, I'm resorting to caricatures here, but the second similarity is in the structure of the public sector. And very broadly, there's a distinction between the upstream bodies, or you refer to in Canada as the central agencies, the core ministries and agencies of the central government, the Ministry of Finance, etc., and the offices that support the head of government. Those agencies that have got functions that cover across sectors, and then the downstream bodies, the sort of last mile service providers and other downstream bodies, including education, health, etc., which are the deliver or commission or fund services. That again is a fairly, it's pretty similar in all settings, whatever the administrative tradition. The third similarity, and this is an important one, I'm going to come back to this in a moment, is the role of those upstream bodies, those central agencies. And we know from quite a sort of body of research on this that the key point here is that those central agencies, that they're doing their job well when they're providing an environment across the public sector that's got three features. That there's credible rules, for whether it's for financial management or for personnel management or accounting or audit, whatever it is. So credible rules that are enforced. Credible policy, so objectives that are legitimate and that are compelling, that really do convey some political authority in terms of what's to be achieved. And very crucially, resource adequacy and predictability. So most importantly, that the spending units do have some confidence that they're getting the budgets that they were promised. And then the final and fourth similarity, wherever we're talking, whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's Canada, is that building trust in government is a pretty important objective. And of course, along with that, there's its ugly step sibling, which is improving support or strengthening support for the political incumbents. So, I'm not saying that's the sort of single or highest objective of reform of the public sector, but it's certainly in there, right? So, four similarities. Now, two big differences that really are driven by the nature of the setting. First is this notion of is the public sector delivering products or is it delivering services? And OECD governments are in a sort of rather curious position. We all know the story about trust in government in the OECD across the last 20 years. There's been this sort of slow decline in trust in government at the national level, and we're sort of familiar with the basics of this. That the nearer you get to the level of service delivery, then the more that the sort of level of trust improves. If people recognise the provider as their local fire station or school, they quite like it, but when they think about government in the abstract, then they're not so keen. But broadly speaking, there has been this long-term secular decline in trust. And one striking feature of that is if you think about the turbulence that we've seen in the public sectors in OECD countries in the last 30 years, then and the improvements in performance that have been achieved, and there certainly have been some, then there's no hint of a return on that public management reform investment in terms of improved trust in government. So whatever that reform has done, it hasn't brought improved trust. And there's likely to be a bunch of reasons for this. And again, there's some reasonable survey evidence about this. And the four front runners. Firstly, we're dealing in OECD settings with a sort of a post-war and a Generation X entitlement generations. I mean, generations in a sense that will never be happy with whatever they're given. They're always expecting more. The second thing to do with the sort of the decreased relevance of national governments in the face of global issues, security concerns, climate change, etc. The third reason, which is sweeping across many countries in the OECD, particularly the Anglo settings, then there's this somewhat politically manufactured concern about overextended governments, so there's simply too much of them. And then fourth is there's some reason to think that, somewhat ironically, that the reforms that we've seen over the last 30 years that have sort of delivered some of the performance improvements have carried the seeds of distrust within them. And we can see this. Les, in his opening remarks, referred to this phenomenon that public sector reform is now a policy domain in its own right. I mean, that is quite a remarkable development. So something that sort of 40, 50 years ago was seen as a sort of, a very sort of minor, rather obscure function somewhere buried deep inside the Cabinet Office or the Prime Minister's office. Now, front and centre, the question of how should we restructure, how should we reform the public sector machinery, it's a major political and policy question. And a lot of what's driven that and how it's been sort of handled politically is to imply that there's a huge problem that's to be solved. It's quite an attractive political part of the political platform. So what it's done is, along with reforming the public sector, it's also conveyed this idea that there is a significant problem with it. So whatever's happened here, then we just haven't seen the return in terms of public trust for all the reform investment. What that's suggesting is the direction of reform in OECD settings is not likely to be improvements in a sort of Fordist production model where we're sort of tweaking the factors of production of various products, education, health products, etc., that are sort of rolling off the belt ever more efficiently. But the direction that the evidence is sort of pointing us towards, it's the reframing of public goods as public services, reversing some growing sense that the client no longer matters individually and that the public service provider has got no interest in the client's personal well-being. So a personalisation of services rather than an impersonalisation of standard and ever more efficiently produced products. And then the second direction, ideally, would be a damping down of the obsessive discussion and churning concerning public management arrangements themselves. Now, this is very different to the situation in low and middle income countries, very different indeed. In many of those settings, impersonal, neutral products is probably the better strategy to go down. It buys more in terms of public support. I mean, not the least because the improvements in performance have got the marginal impact in lower performing public sectors of a performance improvement is higher. But also, and most crucially, in many developing countries, then keeping education, health as sort of as neutral impersonal services probably is exactly the right way to show that it's safe to abandon traditional clientelist, patronage-based relationships between the public and politicians. So the first big difference is that the sort of direction of reform between OECD and developing countries is likely to be very different. OECD towards these more personalised services and developing countries towards more impersonal public goods as products. The second big difference is in the technical frontiers here in terms of public management. Now, over the last 30 years, we really have learned quite a lot about what to do to tweak and improve the old hierarchical models for management. We know quite a bit about career incentives. When new public management came along, we learned quite a bit about the use and abuse of quasi-contracts within the public sector. And then when we began to see the limitations of efficiency gains within hierarchical models, when we realized that they weren't very good at innovation, then along came more market-based or demand-led models, and whatever you think about them, charter schools, citizen scorecards, etc. They help us develop some fairly nifty ideas for how to get the sort of these newer approaches to work. But now we're facing in the OECD a sort of deluge of rhetoric about a new model that's beyond hierarchies, beyond markets. It's something somehow going to address complexity. It's going to rely on networks. It's relational. It's collaborative. It addresses wicked problems. It welcomes innovation. It recognizes the citizens as co-producers of services. So it's trying to address this direction that I touched on a moment ago. But our problem is that we don't really know specifically what it looks like. And there was some marvelous example of the sort of rhetoric that we're now seeing in OECD settings. I was just reading yesterday, actually, let me make sure I got this right. There's an Oxford University handbook of innovations in public management, and they're referring to public managers moving from roles in traditional public management as, quote, clerks and martyrs to a newer role in market-based public management as efficiency and market maximizers, and now the newest role in this new paradigm where public managers are to be explorers. I mean, yes, fine, but what is it? Right, we can see the direction, we can see the aspiration, but what specifically is this model going to look like? There's huge unsolved underneath this rhetoric, and the big one is going to be about how we evaluate and incentivize agencies and individuals when they're part of a complex network, when we can't specify in advance the outputs that they're responsible for. That really does take it into very new territory. So the OECD technical challenge to public management is that we're sort of undoubtedly near the limit of what can be achieved in terms of efficiency improvements in hierarchical structures and market-based mechanisms, but we haven't really got a good handle on what the alternative is going to be. And by contrast, the low-income country challenge is just very different. They're a sort of more industrial style improvement approach is absolutely fine as a strategy. The problem there is that in many settings, the weak link in that particular production chain is the functioning of the central agencies, the upstream bodies. So in many cases, the rules of the game are simply not set and enforced. The enforcement of accounting and personnel rules. Policy can often be pretty arbitrary and patronage-based, and at its worst, then we see in many agencies a sort of an inclination to simply wait out policy reform on the basis that something better and easier will come along pretty soon. And at the weakest point in delivery in many public sectors in developing countries is resource predictability. The bank does regular surveys looking at the relationship between the budget as executed and that which was legislated, and the problems of predictability and resource flow are very strongly correlated with per capita income. So the technical frontiers for public management between the OECD and developing countries is that what we're struggling to understand is very different. In OECD countries, very much to do with the downstream level. What is this new model going to look like more concretely? And in developing countries, it's very much to do with how do we make sure that the central agencies are undertaking their role more effectively. Now, just finishing up very quickly, I just want to end up with sort of these enormous diversity, these great differences between the settings, with two shared risks that are in the urge in both OECD and in low-income settings. First is public management in general remains very susceptible to fashion. Right, the evidence base for our work is very limited indeed, and unsupported claims of best practice continue to give us this way and that. Right, so we remain working in an overhyped and data-poor environment. We still don't have much in the way of solid empirics that really guides us. That risk is something shared between very diverse settings. And the second risk is in both settings, for very different reasons, then it's possible we're going to see public management become even more susceptible to political gamesmanship. In the OECD settings, where this might come from is in this new world of post-hierarchy, post-market, if we do move into more network production of more sort of customer-responsive services, then the weak specification of individual agency outputs will open up the door to potentially much more political scapegoating. This is a refresher. So, I mean, we know there are sort of, three standard blame avoidance approaches that politicians use in relation to public sector. One is spin, to present things to suit their own purposes. The second is proceduralizing policy to make sure that avoiding anything that looks like political discretion, so all the losers seem like the victims of impersonal processes or rules. But the third one, when all else fails, is scapegoat, find an agency blame. If we're moving into a world of much more flexibility, much more innovation, much more ex-ante uncertainty about the contribution of different agencies to service provision, then it opens up the potential for more scapegoating. And curiously, that's a position that developing countries have faced for quite some time, for very different reasons. There, because of the weakness of the state, there's many more non-state providers. Services de facto are provided by much more complex networks of service providers. The state, the politicians, they sort of look on this from a distance. They're sort of somewhat sniping on the sidelines at services which they didn't actually have to produce themselves. And there, we've long seen the evidence that it allows some physical scapegoating of service providers as a distraction from some of the policy errors in those settings. So the shared risks between these very different settings are a fashion-driven managerial turbulence, and then also extending the space for political gamesmanship. Neither of these are inevitable in either the OECD or in the developing countries, but the risks are clearly present in both. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick, for that rosy diagnosis. And we'll now move to our last speaker participant is Bruce Doern.
Thank you very much. I've never used PowerPoint while sitting down. And PowerPoint is vastly misnamed. It does not give you any power at all. And it should have been named too many points from the outset. Anyway, I want to say how happy I am to be here. I'm a retired faculty member from the school and immensely enjoyed all the time that I was involved here and still am to some extent. And of course I retired. I knew I had to retire because of the age coming up. But the other more compelling factor was that when I looked in the mirror, I increasingly realized that my eyebrows had eyebrows. And this was very peculiar. It was very worrying. Now the clever way I'm trying to link this up is to another story that I have just loved. And I only use it about every other speech, not every time. But there was this marvelous article, probably about 4 years ago now, in the New York Times, where a journalist, one of the journalists, was on a holiday, I think, and then visited the town of Peculiar, Missouri. That was the name of the town. And so we visited, spent some time, talked to a few people there, came away with a very good impression. And at the end of the article, he then drew our attention, your attention as a reader, to the sign that was on the road as you entered the town. And the sign said, "Welcome to Peculiar, where the odds are with you." And I think that's actually what you should also think about the School of Public Policy and Administration. Because the odds are with you, but you'll also run into some odd theories and practices, which is what you should get, because that implies range. Anyway, I'm now going to sort of present a couple of things that I think we'll find a way to comment, if not in my actual comment now, then in the way we can follow it up with discussion later. Because what I wanted to do a bit, and if we can, holy cow, I'm skilled at this. I'm going to just pause for a minute to remove the org charts about the nature of the public service as such, and talk initially about the obviously recognized but written about more often, say in the last 20 years, of the main ways in which societies politically and organizationally and economically organize themselves, period. And so that those abstractions and ideal types are partly seen as hierarchy, networks, and markets. I'm discussing them in that order, but probably you should discuss markets first or second because of the kind of order in which the state has developed. So, and I'm just going to deal with these really quickly because what I want to then do is draw out some issues about what happens when these separately, almost each desirable modes of organization then get mixed and collide with each other and get bundled up. And sometimes it is fashion, sometimes it is a genuine effort at reform. So, hierarchy, pretty familiar stuff. Weberian notion of superior subordinate relations in a multi-level hierarchy. It is also seen as a moral system of democratic accountability. You're moving things up to elected officials and to cabinet parliamentary government in that kind of a system. Politically neutral, merit-based civil service. So the civil service becomes, in a sense, a part of that, the construction of that model. Not the same way in every political system, but in the ones that we tend to be familiar with. So hold that thought. Networks, as an organizing phone, tend to be more voluntary relations among groups or individuals to pursue common values and purposes and to organize on that basis. I'm thinking of this historically as well. Usually not non-state centered at their core. And the examples one can think about historically, and that's why I've just put scientific community, the way science evolved as a community. Charities, women's movement, lots of ways in which this was conceptualized. Often or even maybe always outside the state initially, but then to get recognized they then have to become a part of the state, find their niche, find their door, become a ministry or something of that sort. And public service and civil servants were not necessarily explicitly mentioned in this kind of structure in its pure characteristics. But of course, public service always did have notions of what we I guess used to call just informal organization. So interdepartmentally, all sorts of other ways people networked without necessarily calling it that. So that's the second. The third is markets. And again, this is seen as an idealized, highly valued, desirable form of social organization, socioeconomic organization. Voluntary exchange between producers, sellers, and customers, consumers, based on competitive prices, a money economy, centered on property rights, centered on limited liability corporations in part. There's other businesses that aren't limited liability corporations. With this system, and instead of it being seen as, in a sense, outside the state, it is obviously systematically dependent upon the state enforcing all of those kinds of core rules. And of course, even more of them now, because we've extended this to one of the themes I'll just raise, and I might just state it quickly now, is that one of the other themes that's going on in the last 35, 40 years is governments are being exhorted to be more business-like. Businesses are being exhorted to be more public sector-like in various ways. Corporate responsibility, sustainable development, different norms, and you see it when you look across the number. It doesn't mean everybody wants to fully go in either of these directions, but they're under pressure to do so, and therefore they will make some effort, but they will also pull back when they know that it's fundamentally offending the core of these types of organizational beliefs and modes. So those are the three, and I'm going to try and I've picked 3 or 4 areas that from my own kind of experience and research, but I'll also see if I can find ways to comment on what I've been hearing from my fellow panelists who are practitioners in these fields and have lived through them in ways that I haven't. I've studied some of them, but not necessarily lived through them, except inside a university, which has had some of the same kind of developments. I was just giving 2 or 3 because and what I'm trying to do is get at what happens when these are mixed and they collide and people are selecting bits either by fashion or by sincere belief. One of them is, and when I work on science policy and university granting and all that kind of stuff, where you get mandated and required networks. The state says mainly through rules, not in normal regulation, but rules attached to money, that you don't get money unless you bring money. So some of the granting councils have moved in that direction and other funding bodies. And they are networks, but they are mandated. They're in a sense compelled networks. And of course, once you receive money that way and have managed to find other people to get money, you then have to report on in multiple ways in multiple kinds of accountability mechanisms. And so when you think of hierarchy as a form of bureaucracy up and down the system, the more networks you have, in a certain sense, you also have, and especially mandated ones, the more likely you are to have horizontal forms of transaction cost accountability. Just lots of reporting to lots of people in many different ways. And some of these work, some of them don't. And people think of them as annoying requirements. And some others think, well, no, this is the only way to do things in the real world. The other one I've followed quite closely is, in a lot of different areas, is pre-market product and project assessments, drug approvals, patent approvals, that kind of stuff, which historically have been mainly pre-market. In other words, for the civil service level, it's the applicant firm or other applicant wanting the new drug approved or the new patent, and the assessors are frontline civil servants. So the other thing in the discussion of the modern civil service is how do you differentiate between the senior public service, middle levels, and frontline, and the way the frontline interacts with clients and customers. But in this field, what's happening especially in the last decade is the desirable move towards the post-market. In other words, yes, we need to assess these things in the pre-market, but now we need to look at them, once these are on the market, now we need to know what they're actually doing. And you want vastly extended networks. This is certainly the case in drugs and other areas, because you're now going to bring in all sorts of people, doctors, health professionals, who are actually dealing with people who have actually used these products. And now both new good things and new bad things are happening, and they need to be reported back. So that becomes a network of professionals, quasi-professionals, that is extended out spatially and so on. But it is a network, and it's a very different phenomena than the early kinds of assessment where you're kind of face-to-face. The 5 people who are assessing the drug are working with the company, and it's 5 people who are dealing with the drug, or the drug application. So that's one. The second one. The other one I think about partly because at the school and Susan Phillips and others who've worked on this is the charities, where again there's obviously pressure to sort of capture the legitimacy of charities by having them become partners. Then of course they've always had to be registered for tax purposes of people applying to donate to a charity and so on. And then they also become now with mixed goals and thing. And of course they can also get involved in governments or other people challenging whether they've ceased to be just doing good things and have become lobbyists, and then the boundary line between those things. So those are I think some of the other kind of examples, and I was listening to some of the other presentations, and the notion of kind of wicked problems and tame problems, I think, is again interesting, but it's also still a kind of a two-category world, and then most problems are kind of in between those two, depending on which ones you're looking at. A whole of government approach. Well, if the whole of government is thought of in public service terms, that's one thing. But if the whole of government is the emergence of all these networks and new players, some of whom aren't nominally public servants, at least, or maybe in another government, then the whole notion of what that implies, and also whether civil servants are essentially supporting the political system by feeding things to elected people, but civil servants are also the implementers of law. So they don't have to just obey current ministers, they have to obey the laws and the regs and interpret the ones that are guidelines and codes and other levels. So the notion that the modern public service is just moving up for that democratic purpose. There are also any number of statutes, and of course there's more of them created. Some of them are abolished. So that pattern, I think, changes. So I'll leave it there because I think my main purpose was to move it a little bit out of just what's the current structure of public services, but also these other three idealized system, and they're still idealized by a lot of people when they think about what these things might be. When you start to mesh them, then you are creating partly a good new world, but you're also creating a world of contradictions because they will collide when you have a hierarchy in a network and you're dealing with markets that are defined in certain ways and that people do it. So I think increasingly governments have to, well, I think this has always been the case, but I think it's even more so. Governments are now managing contradictions, not just clear goals and so on, but things that do collide with each other. So that's my presentation.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Now, we started a little bit late, and I'm conscious of the fact that we're standing between you and lunch, and we have about 6 minutes. So I'm just going to ask the indulgence of the panelists. We would have had an exchange the way that they had this morning among the panelists, but I'm going to ask their indulgence to forego that exchange amongst ourselves. And in the last few minutes that we have available, just invite any audience members that would like to pose questions. I think we probably have time for 3. So we have one here. And please identify yourself again, please, before you ask your question. And if others could line up at the mics as well, then we can move forward. So.
Okay, David Pringle. I'm a PhD candidate here in the school. I'm also a civil servant, most recently for the federal government at a central agency. Between Weber and Beyond 2020, a traditional bargain was struck between the civil service and government, which provided the civil service space to provide fearless advice and loyal implementation of the government's decisions. Now, there's been a lot of laments by such scholars as Donald Savoy and Peter Aucoin that since the 1970s, this space is slowly eroded and the traditional bargain has become broken. That space we're now, as the panelists have described, is now shared with political staff, media, civil society groups. And perhaps in this new crowded space with a greater scope of responsibilities for the civil servant is ability to provide fearless advice and loyal implementation has become compromised. So my question is, should we try to recover that traditional space that civil servants have occupied, and how do we do that? Thank you.
I don't know who'd like to address that. And Nick, don't be shy. We can always bring you in if you have a response. But perhaps either.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm happy to go ahead. I'm not sure, and I think this is part of the debate that the federal, well, at least within the federal public service, that there was ever truly a monopoly, a special role, that we were the only people whispering in the ears of ministers and giving them our best advice. But regardless of whether that time ever existed or not, I mean, it is fundamentally true that there are many, many sources of ideas and suggestions and recommendations immediately, globally, from one minute to another, at the snap of someone's fingers, you can get information in ways that you never could before. And it's not just that's a social phenomenon, not just a government phenomenon. I would argue that the role of a policy public servant or senior public servant in that environment actually becomes more important. Our clerk talks about kind of the fire hose of information that is coming in at any given time, of data and results and so on, and someone's got to make sense of that, or try to, at least, in terms of forming options. And I think our role of doing that and providing for ministers, not just what the latest flavor is, but what the consequences and implications are broadly, is one that we have to maintain. And they don't have to take, they never had to take our advice, and they still don't. And I think it really is, for public servants to understand their professional role, to continue to provide that, and continue to accept that we may not always be listened to. I know, for the sake of time, and this is one that I think is worth talking about much more deeply, but I'm not as alarmed by the changing role as other outside commentators are. I don't know if you have the same experience. Oh, Nick.
Nick?
Thanks so much. Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was talking to the entire room or just to the technician. I very much agree with Catherine. I mean, I think that I don't know the details in Canada, but more broadly, the trends that we see. I mean, I think the risk of sort of being too pious about this. I mean, there's certainly something to be watched here. But like I think Bruce a moment ago sort of warned us against sort of simple dichotomies. And, you know, as we know, there are two types of people in the world, those who say there are two types of people in the world and those who don't. There's a risk of, like, sort of setting it up as if, you know, there was, particularly in sort of in old Anglo Commonwealth traditions, you know, this completely pure politics-free zone that was in the senior service, and then you know, the risk of eroding that. In fact, it's far murkier than that. I mean, the sort of, you know, it never was quite as sort of free of politics at senior levels as we like to make out. There's a bit of a sort of false history being created. And also, if we look elsewhere in the developed world, I mean, if we look at France or Germany, there's a lot more political involvement at senior levels, and it really does work okay. It isn't the end of the world. So I agree it's something to be watched, but I don't think that's I don't think it's the sort of, you know, the death knell for public service as we've known it.
Great, thank you. Bob?
Yeah, it's Bob Masterson. I'm an alumni. I currently work with a trade association. It's a similar question, maybe to take it to a different level. To a certain degree, we're all hostages of the public policy, public administration we studied. So 15 years ago, new public management seemed to hold a lot of promise. I guess my position, and I'll be a bit provocative, put it out there, yes, politics has always played a role. Governments are elected to do the things they said they would do. But there was a bargain there, and the bargain was the public policy makers, the bureaucracy would figure out how to achieve those objectives and do public service. And I see today, it seems, and we had our chief statistician here, we recently have the comments of our chief electoral officer, and it's not just left, right, and Ottawa, it's all across the boards. The politics is getting down into not just the what, but deeply into the how. And that takes away the ability to have reasoned, results-based, efficient, new public management as we promised 15 or 20 years ago. So I'll put that back. It's the same question, but maybe a different side of the same coin.
So maybe can I try a little bit on this? And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to move the thinking too much forward here, but you know, I think when I reflect back on this, I don't remember a time where there was sort of a pure policy unicorn in the corner of you know, government offices where you know, there was a think tank with a shining light inside. It's always been much messier than that, and there's always been a dynamic exchange between political views and public service analysis and objective options. I think you know, I think what's changed a lot in society, though, is the organization of stakeholder groups around policy ideas. And I think there is a much more able group of stakeholders right across all sorts of policy fields that can call on data and present compelling cases to politicians and move those into the political realm much better than they could in the past. So, you know, I think our role, rather than sort of pure policy formulation, coming up with ideas, doing the analysis, is really providing key support for governments on the implications of those policies they may come in with. A lot of these ideas come across as simple innovations that can be implemented without consequences. We as public servants understand the knock-on effects of many of those things. We can bring analytical tools to the table that actually talk about what the impacts of those will be in society. So, you know, I think there's a big role for us there, and it is an independent role, and it is an objective role, but it is changed, and it's changed a lot because the society that's interfacing with the politicians has changed. I think we're getting the hook here, are we? Sorry.
Yes, and I'm going to have to give the hook to our questioners as well. Please forgive me, but I think our panelists will be around for a few minutes, if not through the entire lunch. And so if you do have a question, you can ask them directly. Just in the interest of time, we do have to be both efficient as well as equitable in this. So we will have, or should have, the results of the poll that we had earlier. That will, so now we know that what are the priorities. We're tied for what were they? They were strategic capacity and horizontal capacity really are the two winners, and the other areas less so. The great thing is that we've got two leading practitioners from the provincial and the federal governments, and hopefully they will take this advice back with them, and you'll all have had an opportunity to influence the modernization of the public service, both at the provincial and the federal level of government. So please join me in thanking our panelists, including Nick.
Well, thank you all, and thank you, Les, for doing such a great job of crafting the question and moderating. I particularly wanted to say something about Bruce, though, because we were entirely too modest in how Bruce was introduced. Bruce, and how he's presented in the program, because we need a whole booklet beyond to do that. Bruce was the second director of the school in 1971. He took over and served for many, many years, but he really created the modern school of public administration, became the school of public policy and administration when we added the degree. 1981, he created how Ottawa spends. He tells a story of how in the early days they used to actually get the books off the press, usually just in time, and he'd drive it around in his old VW van to various bookstores and try to get them to sell it. So, Bruce, the school owes you a great debt, and thank you for coming all the way from the UK.
Shelves at the right level.
So.
Take the other ones off.
I did. I removed several. Anyway, thank you very much, Susan.
The other comments I'd like to, if you're interested more in this topic, Carleton is very fortunate to be hosting a major international conference here, April 9th to 11th. We're doing this in partnership with Canada School of Public Service, IPAC, and other schools. It's the International Research Society for Public Management. This is the 18th annual conference of this association, the first time it has come to North America. It always meets in a policy school, and we are hosting it here in this very, very venue. And we will have something like 430 peer-reviewed papers, great plenary and panels, and about 450 or so researchers from over 45 countries. So you might want to mark that on your calendars, irspm2014.com if you're looking for it on the website. As you can see from the banners, the school offers a suite of programs. Our long-standing degree is the Master of Arts in Public Administration, created in 1953, the first graduate of that program was in 1955. And we've added on to that the PhD in public policy, the first of its kind in Canada in 1992, the graduate diploma in policy and program evaluation and other diplomas we created, the master's of sustainable energy, which is very creatively done with our Faculty of Engineering and Design, so you can do an engineering degree or a policy degree, and our newest, which is the Master's of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership. Our degrees, particularly the long-standing MAPA, or MPA as many of us call it, has been a very versatile degree. It has taken our graduates to a whole variety of places. They work in government at all levels. They are the secretary to the Treasury Board, the commissioner of lobbying, a whole variety of other deputy ministers. They work in SHIRC and at Parliament. They're ambassadors to the OECD currently, to a whole variety of other countries. They are in elected office. For those of you who come to the banquet, the deputy mayor will receive our Distinguished Alumni Award tonight. They work in international organizations and nonprofits and trade associations, in the private sector, working back into government. So at lunch, we're going to give you lots of time to connect, but we've also done a video of some of our alum talking about their experience in the school. We showed it last night, but for those of you who didn't get a chance to see it, it is out there over lunch. And we'll also show some of the historic pictures of the school, really going back to the very early years, the founding years in the early 50s. And if you want to see what Mike Prince looked like with a beard when he was a faculty member here, there is a great snapshot.
He was then known as Sasquatch.
Yes, and you can tell perhaps why. The last thing we don't have a formal program over lunch other than the videos playing because we want to give you lots of time to chat. We will have some background music. Our students are enormously talented, not only at what they do in public policy and administration, but you will hear over lunch from one of our MP&L philanthropy students, Jenna Richards, who plays classical piano. She often plays Chamberfest, so you will probably get a chance to hear her if you go to the next Chamberfest as well, but she'll be out here in lunch. And the jazz trio you heard last night were also Carleton students from our music department. So enjoy and connect over lunch, and we'll see you back afterwards.